They called them sinners, thieves, ghosts, but they were none of those things. They were the ones who built the world that spat them out. When the first wagons rolled west, and the promise of a new life shimmered on the horizon, it wasn't just men who followed that mirage. Women came too, some running from chains, some chasing freedom, and some born with rebellion already burning in their blood. They cooked, fought, gambled, and buried their dead with their own hands. When their husbands were shot or lost to the trail, they picked up the guns themselves and kept riding. And when lawmen came knocking, they didn't beg, they lied, they bluffed, they survived. That was the first sin, survival without permission. The West told them they could work, but not lead. They could heal, but not own. They could love, but never demand to be loved back. But these women broke every rule before the ink on those rules was dry. They ran saloons that hid fugitives, robbed coaches when the men who promised to protect them vanished, and fought side by side with bandits, who respected their courage more than their beauty. There was a woman named Belle who rode with thieves and outshot most of them, a widow named Lottie who turned a deck of cards into a weapon sharper than any blade, a girl called Pearl who robbed a stagecoach just to feed herself when no one else would, and a ghost named Annie who fired a rifle so steady it shook the world awake. They weren't myths, they were flesh, blood, and defiance. And for every one we remember, 100 more were buried nameless beneath a lie. The towns they built still stand, though their names have been painted over, their portraits burned, their stories whispered only by wind that remembers too much. Every wooden beam, every bullet hole in those walls, has a woman's story nailed beneath it. The West wasn't conquered by guns alone, it was held together by hands that stitched, bled, and clenched in silence. And when the history books came, when the writers sat down to tell the tale of how the frontier was won, they wrote about courage, but only the kind that wore a man's face. They told you about sheriffs and outlaws, but never about the women who stared down both and lived to tell it. They erased them. They thought the world would forget, but the dust remembers. The land does not lie. Every gust of wind across those empty plains carries a voice that says, we were here, we mattered, and now, so do you, because you're hearing them. You're standing where the world chose to look away. If you leave now, you'll do what history already did, walk past their graves, and pretend you didn't feel them watching. If you stay, you'll be part of something that refuses to forget. Don't let silence bury them again. Don't let another story die because you were too distracted to listen. Subscribe now, or go to the comments and tell the world why you'd rather stay deaf. Because the only thing worse than being erased is being ignored all over again. The forgotten queens of the West are waiting to be heard, and tonight they will be. She stared into a cracked mirror, one shard showing her face, the other reflecting the pistol she'd used to buy her freedom more times than she could count. Belstar, the bandit queen, but she never wore a crown, never ruled from a throne. Her empire was the road, her soldiers were shadows, and her power came from the one thing no man could strip from her, her will. They said she was born Myra Maybelle Shirley, a farmer's daughter, who learned that the world only played fair when it had a gun to its head. The war came, tore her home apart, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left to believe in but herself. So she saddled up, traded lace for leather, and found her place among outlaws, who respected courage more than virtue. Belle didn't ask to be a legend, she just refused to be a victim. When the law branded her an accomplice, she smiled. When they sent marshals after her, she offered them whiskey before she outrode them. She rode with Jesse James and the younger gang, yes, but not as decoration. When the dust cleared and the shots stopped, she was the one who counted the spoils. They said she was too beautiful for the noose, and too dangerous for a pardon. The truth was simpler, she was too smart for the world that wanted her gone. The West didn't know what to do with a woman who commanded men, a woman who shot straight, thought faster, and slept without apology. So they made her a monster in their stories. Every outlaw needed a devil to chase, and Belle fit the part too well. She married outlaws, buried outlaws, and outlived the ones who thought they owned her. Every man who tried to cage her ended up lost, dead, or forgotten. They said she bewitched them, but magic had nothing to do with it. It was intellect, instinct. She could read a man's lie like others read a map, and in a world where truth meant nothing, that made her lethal. She rode with Jesse James and the younger gang, yes, but not as decoration. When the dust cleared and the shots stopped, she was the one who counted the spoils. They said she was too beautiful for the noose, and too dangerous for a pardon. The truth was simpler, she was too smart for the world that wanted her gone. The West didn't know what to do with a woman who commanded men, a woman who shot straight, thought faster, and slept without apology. So they made her a monster in their stories. Every outlaw needed a devil to chase, and Belle fit the part too well. She married outlaws, buried outlaws, and outlived the ones who thought they owned her. Every man who tried to cage her ended up lost, dead, or forgotten. They said she bewitched them, but magic had nothing to do with it. It was intellect, instinct. She could read a man's lie like others read a map, and in a world where truth meant nothing, that made her lethal. They buried her in a field not far from where she fell, the marker stolen, the grave unkept, and the papers wrote her death like a warning, not a mourning. They called her a cautionary tale, but the dirt remembers differently. The wind that moves through those trees still calls her name, low and sharp, like the whistle of a bullet that never found its mark. Bellstar didn't die for money or revenge. She died because she refused to bow, because she believed a woman could stand alone in a world that only respected chains. Her real crime wasn't theft, it was independence. And that's something the West never forgave. If you remember her only as an outlaw, then you've learned history the way they wanted you to, crooked and convenient. But if you remember her as a woman who lived free, you'll understand why they buried her story so deep. And now you have a choice. You can scroll past this story and pretend you didn't hear her voice. Pretend the dust didn't whisper her name when I said it. Or you can stay. You can listen. Because if stories like this die again, it won't be because history forgot them. It'll be because you did. Don't be the silence that buries another legend. Subscribe before you move on, because Bellstar fought to be remembered. And if you turn away now, you're pulling the trigger she already took. They called her Lottie Dino, but no one ever really knew her name. Some said she was a gambler's widow. Some said she was a preacher's daughter, who ran from God straight into sin. Others said she was the devil's luck made flesh. What's true is this: when she sat at the poker table, men forgot how to breathe. She wore calm like armor. While others bluffed with sweat and nerves, she won with silence. Her hand never trembled, her eyes never lied. And the men who tried to outplay her didn't realize she wasn't gambling with cards. She was gambling with control. In saloons where women weren't even allowed to stand, Lottie sat, dealt, and ruled. No one dared speak over her. No one dared question her winnings. Because she didn't just win, she commanded the room. There was something in her that couldn't be shaken, something that made even the drunkest outlaw sit up straighter when she looked his way. They called her Lottie Dino, but no one ever really knew her name. Some said she was a gambler's widow. Some said she was a preacher's daughter, who ran from God straight into sin. Others said she was the devil's luck made flesh. What's true is this: when she sat at the poker table, men forgot how to breathe. She wore calm like armor. While others bluffed with sweat and nerves, she won with silence. Her hand never trembled, her eyes never lied. And the men who tried to outplay her didn't realize she wasn't gambling with cards. She was gambling with control. In saloons where women weren't even allowed to stand, Lottie sat, dealt, and ruled. No one dared speak over her. No one dared question her winnings. Because she didn't just win, she commanded the room. There was something in her that couldn't be shaken, something that made even the drunkest outlaw sit up straighter when she looked his way. There were whispers that she'd killed a man once, a drunk who tried to take what she wouldn't offer. No trial, no witnesses, just a story told in smoke and hush. That the next morning he was found slumped over the table, and her chair was empty, a single queen of hearts left face up beside his glass. After that, no one tested her twice. Lottie Dino didn't shout, didn't threaten. She didn't have to. Her silence spoke the language every man feared most, the kind that said she could ruin you with a look. And then, as quietly as she appeared, she vanished. No one saw her leave the tables. No one saw her age. Just a legend, folding her last hand and walking out into the night. Some say she found redemption, married that same man, and lived her final years running a church. Others say that was just another bluff, a new name, a new story, another mask over the same fire. But here's the truth no one wrote down: redemption doesn't erase rebellion, it only hides it behind better manners. Lottie Dino didn't stop being dangerous, she just learned how to smile while she was doing it. You think these stories are just nostalgia, dusty myths about women who wore guns and grit, but every one of them risked her life to be remembered, to carve her name in a world that erased them before they were even gone. And you can't even risk a click. Every woman in this story risked her life to be remembered. If you can't risk a click, ask yourself, how different are you from those who burned their names from the record? The desert doesn't keep secrets, it burns them away, one grain of sand at a time. And somewhere out there, between the red cliffs and the dying light, rode Pearl Hart, the last stagecoach robber the West would ever know. She wasn't running for gold, she was running for breath, because survival, for women like her, was the only crime worth committing. They said she looked like a school teacher, but the West taught its lessons in blood and hunger. When her husband left her broken, she didn't cry, she adapted. When the mines closed and the work dried up, she didn't beg, she rode out. And when the world offered her nothing, she took what she needed, with a pistol in her hand, and a prayer that didn't reach heaven. The newspapers called it the Lady Bandit's blasphemy. They said she robbed the stagecoach like a villain in a dime novel. Soft voice, steady aim. But what they didn't print was that she apologized after. She told the passengers she only needed enough to get home. And when she was done, she handed one man a few dollars back, saying, "You need this more than I do." That's who she was. The outlaw bride of the Badlands, caught between survival and shame, living proof that desperation wears many faces. When they caught her, she didn't flinch, she didn't beg or deny. She just said, "I shall not consent to be tried under a law on which my sex had no voice in making." And for a moment, every man in that courtroom forgot he was supposed to laugh. Every man in that courtroom forgot he was supposed to laugh. The press loved her, called her the Desert Rose with a pistol. They sold her story like spectacle, turned her into a star for the same reason they wanted to hang her. She became both devil and darling, a symbol of everything the West wanted to worship and destroy. Men came to the jailhouse just to see her. They wanted to meet the woman who robbed a stagecoach with nothing but charm and courage. They expected a savage. They found a lady with her hair tied neatly back, quoting poetry and rolling her own cigarettes. She gave interviews, smiled for cameras, and when they asked why she did it, she said, "A woman has to live, don't she?" That line became legend. That smile, immortal. But the fame didn't last. It never does. When the crowds moved on and the papers stopped printing her name, she vanished. Some say she ran a boarding house under another name. Some say she returned to the desert, where the wind forgets everything except the echoes of the brave. What's certain is this: the law broke her body, but never her will. And the West never forgave her for surviving on her own terms. Pearl Hart didn't rob for greed. She robbed because no one else was going to save her. And when she did it, the world mistook her hunger for rebellion. Because, in truth, they're the same thing. Survival was rebellion in disguise. And the West was terrified of a woman who knew that. You can almost feel her there, in that dry wind that smells like dust and defiance. And maybe that's the real reason her name isn't in textbooks, because every time you say it, you remind the world that even when it buried her, she refused to stay dead. History already buried her once. If you listen and walk away now, you're shoveling the dirt back over her name. Don't do what they did. Subscribe, because silence is how legends die twice.
They called her the Thorny Rose, but her name, the one the world buried, was Laura Bullion. The only woman to ever ride with Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch, and the law didn't fear her because she killed men. They feared her because she belonged nowhere, and needed no one. She rode dressed like a man, her head low, her eyes sharper than the colt on her hip. When the gang robbed trains, she wasn't waiting in the shadows. She was riding shotgun, counting every bullet, every dollar, every heartbeat before the next chase began. And when the Pinkertons came hunting, they wrote her name in bold, as if ink could tame what they couldn't catch. Laura wasn't born for the saddle, she was born for survival. Her father drank himself out of hope, her mother worked herself into the grave, and the only lesson Laura learned early was this: a woman who waits to be saved never will be. So she found her own salvation, the only way the frontier offered it, on the back of a horse, beneath the barrel of a gun, and behind men who thought they were leading. When she met the Wild Bunch, they didn't know what to make of her. But one job in, and the whispers stopped. Laura planned the routes, picked the disguises, and when bullets flew, she never missed. But what the law hated most wasn't her crimes, it was her calm. She smiled through interrogations, flirted with sheriffs, and walked into court like a woman arriving at a dance. Her beauty disarmed them, her mind destroyed them. They wanted her to break, to cry, to prove that beneath the hat and the legend, she was still just a woman. She never gave them the satisfaction. They said she carried love letters from Ben Kilpatrick, her partner in crime. But if you read between the lines, you'll see it wasn't romance that kept her there. It was equality. They rode side by side, not master and mistress, but outlaw and outlaw. And that balance terrified the West more than any robbery ever did. When they finally caught her in 1901, she didn't plead for mercy. She asked for a mirror, straightened her collar, then said, "If I'm going to prison, I'll look the part." And every man in that room remembered her long after she was gone. She served her time, walked out free, and like the rest of them, vanished into legend. Some say she changed her name, lived quietly as a seamstress until she died old and unrecognized. But I don't buy that, not for a second. Women like Laura Bullion don't fade. They wait, they linger. They survive in the corners of history that still make the powerful uncomfortable. Because her real weapon was never her gun. It was her freedom, and the law feared that more than bullets. Now think about this. They erased her so thoroughly that even her grave went unmarked for decades. But here you are, listening, which means she won. Because every time her name is spoken, the silence loses again. If you leave this story without subscribing, You're no better than the men who buried her name. They silenced her once, don't give them the victory twice. Hit subscribe, not for me, but for the woman who made the law tremble. They called her at a place, but even that name was smoke, a mask. A beautiful lie worn by a woman who refused to let the world write her truth. Before the Wild Bunch, before the headlines, she was someone else, a daughter, a teacher, a lady, maybe even a wife. The details shift like sand, because she made them that way. She was what she needed to be, when she needed to be it. And when she met Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, the world as she knew it burned down. She didn't fall for an outlaw. She fell for the only kind of man who didn't flinch at her fire. He taught her how to shoot. She taught him how to think before pulling the trigger. Together, they built something between sin and salvation. A love story too wild for the world to tolerate. When the Wild Bunch rode, she wasn't left behind sewing tears into shirts. She was in the saddle, steady, silent, watching the horizon for lawmen. She carried her own gun, and when bullets came, she didn't scream. She aimed. The Pinkertons couldn't handle that. They didn't even know what to call her. One report described her as a refined lady, about 22 years old, intelligent, educated, and entirely fearless. And that last word, fearless, that's the one that damned her. Fearless women were not supposed to exist. Not in that century. Not in that land. She rode through fire and dust beside two of the most hunted men in America. But what made her dangerous wasn't that she followed them. It's that she didn't have to, she chose to. And choice, in a world of chains, is the purest rebellion. They crossed borders like ghosts, from Texas to Wyoming, from train lines to safe houses. Everywhere they went, her legend grew. A whisper, a question, a myth. Men couldn't decide if she was a saint or a siren. But they all agreed on one thing, she never looked afraid. And then came South America. Bolivia, 1901. The end of the trail. Butch, Sundance, and Etta. 3 souls chasing freedom in a world that refused to give it. The papers wrote that they robbed banks, lived in luxury, danced in silence while wanted posters crossed oceans after them. But the truth is quieter. Etta was tired. She'd seen too many dawns colored by gunpowder, too many dreams bought with fear. She told Sundance she wanted out, and he promised her one last job. That last job turned into gunfire. And when the smoke cleared in San Vicente, 2 bodies lay dead. A man and another beside him. They said it was Butch and Sundance. No one ever proved it, but Etta, she was gone. No body, no trace, no goodbye. Some claimed she died there too, others swore she came home under a new name. That she worked as a nurse in Denver, a teacher in New York, even a wealthy widow in Texas who never took off her gloves. There are graves that could be hers, photographs that might show her face. But no proof, and maybe that's the point. Etta Place didn't vanish because the world lost her, she vanished because she wanted to. She chose disappearance over capture. She chose silence over spectacle. She chose to become her own legend. One no man could own, no historian could define. The frontier made her an outlaw, the world made her a ghost. But she made herself eternal, think about that. A woman who erased her name, her past, her record. Not because she was defeated, but because she refused to be defined. She didn't want immortality, she wanted peace. And peace, for her, meant never being found. There's something almost sacred about that. Because in the end, Etta Place became what every outlaw dreams of, untouchable. The Pinkertons kept her file open for 20 years. Every year, a new agent would write, still missing, still at large, still no trace. And every year, that sentence said more about her power than any bullet ever could. She didn't die with the men she loved. She didn't grow old in chains. She walked out of history at midnight, and never looked back. Some say that's cowardice, I say that's victory. Because if freedom had a face, it would look a lot like hers. You can almost hear her still. A whisper carried on desert wind, a laugh in the dark when no one's there. She's not haunting the West. The West is haunting her. Because it never got to win. Etta chose to vanish, you don't have that excuse. If you listen to her story and walk away without subscribing, you're doing exactly what history did, pretending she never existed. Don't be one of the ghosts that silence her. Subscribe before she disappears again. They called her many things, whore, devil, temptress, But her name, the one whispered behind silk fans and courtroom doors, was Belle Brezing. The world said she was immoral. But the truth, she was unstoppable. Born in Kentucky, raised in poverty, Belle's story began where most women's stories were meant to end, in shame. Her mother ran a brothel, her father drank away their dignity, and by 16, the world had already decided what Belle was worth. She disagreed. She learned early that virtue didn't feed you, and respect never came cheap. So she built her own kind of empire, one built not on forgiveness, but on power. Belle didn't just sell sign, she owned it. She ran her house like a queen's court, velvet walls, crystal glasses, and rules sharper than razors. No violence, no drunkenness, no disrespect. Her girls were educated, clothed, protected. While men in polished boots preached purity by day, they knelt in her parlor by night. And Belle, she kept their secrets, for a price. She became the woman the entire city feared to offend, and every powerful man feared to cross. They said governors, judges, even preachers visited her house. They said when she smiled, it could cost a man his career. They said she could destroy anyone, and the worst part, she never had to. They destroyed themselves just by being near her. But make no mistake, it wasn't glamour that made her dangerous, it was control. In a world that punished women for being seen, Belle made herself impossible to ignore. She wore the very shame they tried to bury her with, and turned it into a crown. And when they called her a sinner, she smiled and said, I built my house with the stones they threw at me. When the law tried to shut her down, she paid their wages. When the press tried to expose her, she hosted their editors. She didn't just play the game, she rewrote it. And yet, behind all the grandeur, there was a kind of sadness too. Because Belle knew the world would never forgive her for winning. The men she protected, the society she served, would all remember her name, but never admit why. When she died in 1940, the city that had condemned her shut down completely for her funeral. Doctors, lawyers, ministers, they lined the streets. The same men who once called her filth now called her a lady. They gave her the respect she demanded her whole life, but only after she couldn't see it. And maybe that's the cruelest part of her legend. Belle Brezing wasn't a story about lust or scandal. She was a story about power, a woman who weaponized what was meant to destroy her. She turned every insult into income, every humiliation into leverage, every whisper into authority. The West pretended to forget her, but the truth is, it's built on women just like her, women who learned that the only way to survive was to own the thing they were condemned for. Respectability was never given to Belle Brezing. She took it, and she made the world watch while she did it. Now tell me, if she could face the entire world with her reputation on fire and still walk with her head high, what's your excuse for staying silent? Belle Brezing turned shame into power. If you can't even turn curiosity into a click, then maybe you're no different from the men who used her and forgot her. She faced the fire. You just have to hit subscribe. Don't let her win alone. They said she was a thief, a rustler, a woman too wild to be saved, but her real crime was simpler. She dared to own land the men wanted, and her name was Ella Watson, though history spat it out as Cattle Kate. She came west chasing freedom, but freedom doesn't come cheap, not for a woman alone. She worked every sunrise, earned her land fare, paid her dues, and refused to bow to any man who thought her signature meant nothing. And that's what damned her. Because in those days, a woman with a deed to her own land was a threat. And threats didn't get trials, they got rope. The men who called themselves ranchers, those who wore God and law like matching pistols, decided one night that Ella had lived long enough. They came riding at dusk. She thought it was business. They said it was justice. And by morning, she was hanging from a cottonwood tree beside her husband, their boots brushing the dirt they'd once owned. No trial, no jury, just a story written by men who wanted her gone. They called it a warning to women who thought the frontier could belong to them too. But the truth they buried was this: Cattle Kate wasn't a thief. She was the first woman to legally own land in Wyoming, and they couldn't stand it. So they rewrote her into an outlaw, turned her into a bedtime story for boys who wanted to feel brave, and a cautionary tale for girls who wanted too much. For decades, her name was dragged through the mud. Every book, every headline, every campfire retelling, all the same lie. But records don't rot like rope does. And when the papers were finally found, the truth came crawling out. Ella had paid for her land, signed her name fair and square. The men who hanged her, they stole it after she swung. That's how justice worked in the West. You could own the law if you owned enough bullets. And if you were a woman, the only thing they let you own was your silence. But Ella never stayed quiet. Even in death, her name rose again. Because you can't hang a story once it's told right. And maybe that's why they feared her most, because she wasn't supposed to exist. She wasn't supposed to fight back, or build, or survive long enough to matter. The men who hanged her, they stole it after she swung. That's how justice worked in the West. You could own the law if you owned enough bullets. And if you were a woman, the only thing they let you own was your silence. But Ella never stayed quiet. Even in death, her name rose again, because you can't hang a story once it's told right. And maybe that's why they feared her most, because she wasn't supposed to exist. She wasn't supposed to fight back, or build, or survive long enough to matter, but she did. And she left behind a question the West never answered. If the law hanged an innocent woman, what does that make the law? She died trying to own a piece of earth, and the world pretended it didn't notice. But maybe, tonight, someone hears her name again, Ella Watson, and realizes the story was never about land at all. It was about power. Who gets to hold it, who gets to keep it, and who has to die to prove they ever had it. She was hanged as a thief, but remembered as something else. The first widow sheriff of her own damn fate, because no rope could choke the truth out of her. It just made the world remember her louder. They said justice was blind, but it saw Ella Watson and chose to look away. If you scroll past her story, you're no better than the men who turned their backs while she swung. Hit subscribe, not for me, but for her, because silence is how they win. They say the West died a long time ago, that the dust settled, that the guns went quiet. But I don't believe it, because some nights, when the wind moves through those hollow towns, you can still hear them, not the men, not the sheriffs or the outlaws, the women, Belle Starr, Lottie Dino, Pearl Hart, Belle Brezing, Ella Watson. Names once whispered in saloons, now buried under sermons and history books. But they're still here, every time a woman refuses to ask for permission. Every time someone stands alone against a world built to break them. They said these women were wild. They said they were sinners. But the truth, they were free. And freedom, real freedom, doesn't die easy. It rides through time like a bullet that never lands. It hides in the bloodline of rebellion, in the spine of every woman who ever refused to bow, in the heartbeat of every man who ever learned what strength truly looks like. The bandit who defied the law, the poker queen who ruled with silence and smoke, the outlaw bride who robbed for survival, the madam who turned shame into power, the widow who died for justice. They were never just stories, they were warnings. Reminders that history doesn't forget you. It buries you alive, and waits to see who will dig you back up. And that's what this is. Not entertainment, not nostalgia, a resurrection. We are not retelling their stories. We are reviving them, so remember this. Every time you scroll past, every time you ignore the ones who were erased, you're helping bury them all over again. If you walk away now, you're no better than the ones who tied the noose. You've heard their names. You know their truth. You don't get to pretend ignorance anymore. Subscribe, or let the ghosts remind you what forgetting costs. They weren't queens because of crowns or titles. They were queens because they ruled what couldn't be taken. Their will, their silence, their survival. And though the West is gone, its bones remember them. Every abandoned church, every cracked mirror, every piece of sky that still smells like gunpowder and rain. They lived for freedom. They died for defiance. And maybe that's what haunts us still. The knowledge that they didn't need saving, they needed remembering. Because history didn't kill them, forgetfulness did. And tonight, you brought them back. You think subscribing is just a click. It's not. It's proof you heard them. It's a mark that says, I won't let the silence win again. So go ahead, hit subscribe, or walk away and join the ones who buried them the first time. If these legends made you feel the dust of forgotten roads, ride with us again. Because every shadow in the West has a story worth remembering. Music fades, low, mournful, like the heartbeat of the desert after sunset. And the final line, spoken like a whisper from the past, They called them sinners. We call them queens. Fade to black.